All right, welcome to the final panel of the day. My name is Heather Anderson, and I'm executive editor at Credit Union Times. So everybody boo about interchange. I've been hearing that all day. The panel is entitled Lockdown, Payment Security in a High-Risk World. And we have 4 excellent panelists today that have just fantastic experience in that area. I will let them introduce themselves and talk a bit about their backgrounds, and then I'll ask a few questions to get the ball rolling, but we would also like to take questions from the audience. So feel free when we're ready for that. Go ahead and start. John, you want to start?
Sure. So I'm John Dansu. I'm the CEO of Ideology, and thanks for hanging in until the end of the day here. I appreciate it. Ideology is an identity verification / fraud platform company. We've been around for close to 10 years. We work with a broad range of companies and basically are helping with account authentication and then also step-up authentication. Also, what I think is more relevant to what we're going to talk about today is we recently announced our move into mobile identity. And Ideology has basically secured access data from carriers. And we basically have taken that data combined with network data and device data, and now we're able to establish a mobile identity alias that basically can get tied to one of these devices. And the benefit of that basically is by establishing a bind to a phone, you're able to establish persistence. So that moves us into the transaction business on the mobile side, right? So every time that somebody comes back to a mobile device and wants to complete a transaction, we basically have an under-the-covers way of validating that that person is the same individual, and there's been, if there's been a change event on the phone, for instance, for them moving from AT&T to wireless, or they ported their line, or they swapped their SIM card, we're able to move the persistence with those change events. So that's kind of a really high level of what we're doing on the mobile side, and hopefully as we get into this, we can talk more about that.
Great, thank you.
Yeah.
Naomi?
Yeah. Hi everyone, my name is Naomi Lurie, and I'm from a company called Gemalto. We're a digital security company. That means that banks and governments entrust, and mobile network operators entrust us with the most sensitive data and request us to provision that onto a device or onto a chip. So odds are that unbeknownst to you, you're carrying a Gemalto smart card in your pocket. It's either in your mobile phone or it's in one of those new snazzy EMV chip cards that you got from your bank recently. And now when it comes to mobile payments, we have these sensitive credentials. The payment credentials are moving from the plastic cards, they're moving into mobile devices, they're moving into wearable technology, and they're also moving from hardware to the possibility of software-only environments. So it is our role to help our issuers, the issuers of those credentials, whether they're banks or governments or network operators, to be able to make that transformation, and we help them deliver those security credentials into the destination of their choice.
Hello, my name is Rennie Allen. I work for a company called ArcSand Technologies, and we make a tool set that allows you to protect your application against tampering. So we have 2 products. One is anti-tamper. So basically, it takes your software and makes it very difficult to tamper with. And the other one is a white box cryptography solution, which allows you to perform cryptographic operations on your mobile device without exposing the key. The key is maintained in encrypted form while the crypto operations are being performed. And in the mobile payments industry, that's most often used to provide the software equivalent of the hardware secure element. So basically, by anti-tampering the software and building in a white box cryptography, you can build a software deployable secure element that cannot have the keys extracted from it and yet is scalable.
Thanks. Good afternoon. My name is John Jones. I'm president of Trulioo. Trulioo is a global leader in identity verification based out of British Columbia, Vancouver. We have access to around 140 data sources today. That covers about 40 countries. and we actually provide a gateway service to our clients. So the countries that we have today include China, India, Australia, several within EMEA, APAC and the LATAM regions, so pretty wide coverage. The clients we have in the payment space, examples are PayPal and Square, so we've got some very large clients behind us. And really, the use cases are pretty wide. So whenever there's a KYC or AML need, either domestically or cross-border, and that's really where we're trying to focus. So the three areas and three trends we're seeing that we're trying to help address. Firstly is the international growth of our clients. So I saw a statistic, in 2000 there were 14 of the top Fortune 500 clients that were based out of or had a presence in emerging cities. That's going to be around 230 come 2025, so obviously a huge increase in the amount of growth that our major clients are seeing. Addressing the globalization of commerce, obviously a hot topic for today. In China last year there was a 63% increase in online sales last year. In India it's about 32% was last year, and that's obviously going to continue to grow as we move forward. Obviously with that comes a much higher increase in chargeback rates. So the average is about 2 times international to domestic, and that's a great play for identity verification electronically, where that can be used to help minimize the risk. And finally, it's a passion of Trulioo's, where the company was formed, is addressing the underbanked or the unbanked. Today there's approximately 2.5 billion people that are classed in that category. About 1 billion of those have a mobile phone. So obviously a fantastic opportunity to leverage that technology going forward and helping that underbanked population. As part of that, we have a cyber identity element to our data source network. A lot of our sources would be viewed as traditional. We have a large cyber ID piece, which is more social network driven, payment driven, and that we can use to help address the underbanked population.
Fantastic. Thanks, John. All right, so I will start off with some questions, and we'll start with John on the end, John Jones. Fighting fraud can be a real pain for the user, right? So how could the objectives of fraud detection and minimal customer friction be balanced?
Yeah, I'm sure John has some opinions on this one as well.
Oh, please join in after he's
a
done.
passion of mine. I used to work for Experian for a number of years, and that was really a key objective that we tried to solve. I think that the customer friction piece is obviously huge today. There's a lot of tools in the market that can be used to identify consumers, but a lot of them are very consumer unfriendly or can be consumer unfriendly. So within a pure identity space, tools like knowledge-based authentication, even one-time passwords, when used in the right way, they're very effective, but they're always going to be very unfriendly from the consumer side. Within an existing account, there's also a lot of technologies that can be used today, so location services, linkage analysis, device fingerprinting, they're all very seamless to a consumer. I think the issue for now, and it has been for a number of years, is that initial registration. So how do you prove that person is who they say they are when they're initially given that credential? There's a lot of work across the government schemes today around connect.gov in the US, verify.uk.gov in the UK. Canada also participated in the scheme as well. We're really trying to have this federated identity where it can be reused and reused. I think the issue with that is the issue of liability when it does go wrong, so who actually carries the can, and also the levels of assurance that those credentials are actually going to be applied to. So if it's a simple type of authentication that's needed, a simple service, that's obviously very different than a credential that's needed for more of a high-risk transaction.
Okay, John, would you like to add?
Sure. So how many of you think your identity's been stolen? Raise your hand. Okay. All your hands ought to be raised, right? Because that's one of the issues that's really happening in the marketplace today, is with the breaches, the Anthem breach, 80 million identities, rookie mistake. They didn't encrypt their data behind the firewall, so it was pretty easy to get, right? So we call that the perfect identity. So the issue of fraud is really expanded pretty dramatically from a standpoint of if somebody knows your name and your address and your social and your year of birth, somebody knows your name, your address, your social, and your year of birth, they can get through a lot of monitors that are out there today. So you really have to have tools that give you the ability to look beyond just identity information and the matching of that data. And John mentioned some of those, right? The activity type things, location-based factors, device-based factors. Those are things that are all really important relative to those issues. When it comes to mobile payments and those issues, I think some of the what's been talked about here a little bit of really being able to secure that device and to make sure that basically that device becomes an additional factor relative to that identity is also critically important. And you know what I talked about at the beginning of being able to bind the challenge on the phone, right? As phones change, there's 8 million change events on phones on a daily basis, right? So somebody changes from Verizon to wireless, to AT&T. They swap their SIM card. Those are things that basically, when it comes to device fingerprinting, makes it very difficult for you to basically peg that phone again. So you need to look at solutions that are basically going to give you the ability to transfer that identity from one phone to another and keep consistency in that. And that gets to the bind and the persistence identity stuff that I talked about at the beginning.
Fantastic, thank you. Do you have any other fraud trends to share?
Oh, it's happening daily and it's getting worse.
That ain't a trend.
Yeah, no, I tell people the good news is fraud is growing. The bad news is fraud is growing. Obviously, it helps our business because from a standpoint of what we do. This is what I say about fraud. The people on the other side, this is their job. It's organized, it's planned, and it's long range. So when people go to start stealing tax returns in February 1st, when that tax window opens, they're already planning for that today. They're doing things to basically try to probe and find out where weaknesses are. The other thing that fraudsters do is when they find a weakness, they will hit it and hit it hard. If they get stopped, they'll move on. And you can just see it. I mean, they'll come and they'll blast you, and then when they get stopped, they move on to something else. So the key on fraud, and a part of all this is to have layers, right? No one here has the perfect solution for all this stuff, right? You have to have multiple layers and multiple vendors relative to addressing these issues to make sure that you have a whole bunch of stops for these guys. It's just the nature of it. So anyhow, they're getting smarter and quicker and better. Do you want to take a question or?
Yeah, someone has a question? Please.
So with the likelihood of fraud shift to card not present that we saw in Europe and we expect to see in the U.S., and with the U.S. being kind of the last major market to really adopt EMV, will we see a shift back to card present fraud once there's deeper penetration of EMV in the U.S.? Because EMV will be then more ubiquitous.
You want to answer that?
Yeah, so I suspect you will. And you know, if mobile payments actually takes off, that fraud will take, you know, card present will actually be, you know, a malware on your phone. That fraud will be, and they're not going to do that yet because there's easier ways to do it. But once it's closed, that's where they will be.
I think it's a good point, like the whole analogy about the balloon, which I guess is very overused. So the fraudster's going to go where it's easiest. So until it becomes like a lockdown in some ways on certain areas, they're going to attack the weakest point. So I agree with John in that aspect. It is a game, right? You have to be better than the people down the street. I think that's still probably the tactic I'll take.
So I don't have to be the fastest, I just have to be faster than the guy behind me.
Yeah, it's like the bear. You have to be quicker than the bear. You just need to be quicker than your friend.
I like that. Does anyone else have any questions for our panel? I have plenty of questions, so we'll continue. All right, Naomi, we haven't heard from you yet. Today we heard a lot about Apple Pay, and we had the gentleman from Google speaking about the new Android Pay. What is the difference between the security technology used for those two payment systems?
Yeah. Well, Apple Pay, because Apple actually owned the complete experience, they own the device, they own the operating system, and the wallet application, they have the privilege of using the most secure option for their credentials. That means putting the payment credentials, the credit card information, inside a chip that's embedded in the device. And also using, for their fingerprint sensor, they're storing fingerprint information in a very secure place on the device as well, although not in the chip, but in an isolated area of the operating system. When it comes to Android Pay, although it's not yet out on the market, but we do know that due to the device fragmentation, and Android is on many, many devices, the credentials cannot be stored on the chip. So they're stored in software application. I'm sure for Android Pay, they will also make use of the security features that are part of the operating system of Android as well to strengthen that security. When you're going into a software-only environment, there are obviously risks that are associated with that. Some of those can definitely be mitigated by technology like Rennie's company has for white box crypto, which is basically a way of, and you'll go into that in more details, I'm sure, of hiding the key assets, the keys, the algorithms, and everything inside the code in a way that it can't be easily extracted. And there are other possibilities. For example, many of the new Samsung devices, if we look from the Galaxy S5 and S6, they all have something that's called Trusted Execution Environment, which is what? Yeah? Knox, okay, right. So part of the operating system, there's an area in the operating system that you can use and put your sensitive credentials inside a container, and then no malware can get into that container. So it's almost like a virtual chip, it's protected. And that can be used to further secure the information in there. So I think just to add to the question that was raised here from the audience, I think that fraud is like water looking for a crack to seep through. So there's always going to be, looking for that crack and looking for that low place to go through. So as something else closes up, everyone's going to start challenging the existing thing. So security is a moving target. And as anyone who's going to be putting a mobile wallet or a mobile payment solution out in the market, you have to bear in mind that there's no, permanent fix. Now I'm done. Rather, you have to always be on the lookout and always thinking 2 steps ahead, and at least being with infrastructure that's agile enough to allow you to up the security level when the risks become uncovered. Okay, so you don't want to find yourselves on the day that it hits with no possibility to take it to the next level.
Fascinating. So, Rennie, let's ask you to talk a little bit more about some of the tools that are available to help mobile app developers improve security.
So basically, there's as Naomi was saying, if you happen to have the privilege of having a closed environment like Apple does, you can use different solutions, and Samsung is much the same way. They sort of have a closed ecosystem that's just Samsung devices. In the general Android world, there's literally thousands of vendors of handsets, and so if you want a scalable solution, you have to go to a pure software solution. So what our tools do is provide software anti-tamper. So the way this works is you take your binary code and you pass it through a tool that we provide. That tool disassembles your binary code, finds the locations where tampering can occur. You basically explain to it where tampering can occur, and it will inject new machine code that will then protect that part of the code against tampering. So, for example, with the Whitebox crypto engine, we can inject code into the Whitebox engine that checksums binary code inside your application outside of it, so that if an attacker tries to lift the Whitebox out, because that's the natural attack on a Whitebox, would be for them to take the Whitebox out and to try and use it standalone to bypass your controls, your business logic. When they do that, it will no longer run because it is not in the context of your application. So the idea is to tightly bind the crypto, which is using an obfuscated key, a key that can't be itself is encrypted, and to bind that to your business logic, so that whatever transaction is done with that crypto is your logic and not some tampered logic that an attacker is trying to effect. And like we said, like right now, there's a lot of easier ways to attack things than to do malware that attacks apps. So right now, there's not a lot of presence of it in the mobile payment space. Although we're a highly horizontal technology, and we've seen it in other mobile apps to a large extent. But it just hasn't turned up here yet because there's easier ways to do it. And as soon as there isn't an easier way to do it, then you will see malware that does this.
Right. Any follow-up questions? All right. Yeah?
I'll talk with you offline, actually.
Okay. All right. Naomi, you talked a little bit about what you have to keep in mind when you're developing an app. And I'm sure all four of you could probably contribute to this question. Do you have any advice for an issuer or retailer or any other third party that's planning to develop a mobile payment app?
Well, I guess my advice would be definitely to consider security and not to try to solve it on your own, rather to use the cutting edge technology that's provided by security vendors. Just because it is, if any of you are technical and you followed Rennie's explanation about all the mathematical algorithms that need to go in to keep the data safe, the data during the provisioning process onto the device, when it sits at rest at the device, when it's used for computation of making a transaction. So there are so many pieces that you need to take into consideration that I think that it's wise for anyone that's going that route to choose to work with a security vendor. And you can use, as a retailer, white box crypto is definitely available to everyone. My company works more with the issuer. So if you're a retailer that also issues payment credentials, then you should work with a digital security company that can help you secure those credentials, from the onset and through the delivery and their use on the handset.
Yeah, and Naomi makes a good point, which she made earlier, which is that don't be caught, with your pants down, so to speak, which is that you haven't planned for this. When finally those other holes close up, and then you find out that you have nothing protecting your back end. So plan ahead, be ready with another level of security, one step ahead of the bad guys, basically.
The other thing that I would say, and I think companies are getting more and more focused on this, is stop the person at the beginning before they get into the app, right? And it can be additional cost, especially if you have something that doesn't generate a lot of revenue to begin with. But companies are trying to figure out who good customers are, who legitimate customers are at the beginning. Because if you do that, then you don't have the problems on the back end when you have to do the transaction monitoring and processing. So think about authenticating your customers at the very beginning of the process, and you keep out certain of the bad folks, and then overall you'll save time and effort, because there's a whole bunch of cost for fraud, right? It can be the actual dollar cost, but it's also the time and effort of having to deal with that. That's kind of the softer cost. So validate early and keep the bad guys out.
Yeah, I would echo John's point as well. I obviously come from more of an identity background myself, so I definitely have that same point of view. There's a lot of alternative technologies we were looking at one point a few years ago where even in terms of a one-time password, it didn't really need to send a password through. We could actually look at the actual location of the phone versus the location of the device that it was coming from, try and match the two together through device fingerprinting. So there's a lot of techniques that are very consumer-friendly to authenticate in a very strong way.
Excellent. Any questions? All right. Rennie, you mentioned that it's important to stay ahead of the bad guys. How do you do that? It seems like so much of security is reactive. How do you know what they're planning next?
Yeah, so that's, that's why we're sort of a company you've probably never heard of, is we're much more on the proactive side of security. So basically, what we do is a very unusual thing to do, which is that we protect applications that are in completely compromised environments. So when you're working in mobile, that device is completely compromised. You have to consider it completely compromised. The person who owns that phone can root it, they can jailbreak it. The Supreme Court has said they're allowed to jailbreak it, they're allowed to modify their phone and do whatever they want. So you cannot trust the environment. So for instance, device fingerprinting, right? Like there's a toolkit called App Use. You can Google it right now and you can download it, and it basically allows you to emulate any device, all the parameters of the device exactly. And it boots up Android. You can install standard Android on it. It's a virtual environment, and you can give it whatever amount of memory you want. All of the attributes of the operating system can be completely emulated. And so basically, your fingerprinting you'll be able to emulate a fingerprint of an actual user's device. So you have to be thinking about all of those capabilities that a user of your device has, and you have to be mounting countermeasures against them before you ever start. So stay one step ahead of them. Our technology allows you to tell if you're on a rooted device, to tell if you're on a jailbroken device, and you can basically don't authenticate people that are doing it from jailbroken or rooted devices. That sort of technology. So you always want to be one step ahead. Just be familiar with the tools. They're all out there. You can Google them. You can say, hack an Android phone, hack an iOS device, and you will get all the tools you need. So you can find out exactly what's available and just make sure you have protections against that.
What about from the customer verification end? How can
Yeah, I
you
was going to
stay ahead
say,
of fraudsters?
as I mentioned, they're long-term planners. It's their job. So you need to have systems that are pretty adaptable to what's happening, right? And you need to look at data on a daily basis to see new fraud trends. They're really clever, the things that they do. And if you're paying attention to what the transactions and reviewing those transactions, you'll have the ability to see new trends and then address them if you have configurable systems. The other thing that I would encourage people to do is to collaborate. The best tool against fraud is to collaborate with your competitors, actually, right, and share. And we encourage our customers to do that and help facilitate that. They'll kill each other for a new account, but when it comes to fraud, we all sit at a table and we all talk about it and we figure out ways and we share. Because they're moving from one entity to another and they're doing it quickly. So collaboration, in my mind, is one of the number one tools to basically help stop fraudulent transactions. And our systems basically facilitate that and encourage that behavior among our customers.
All right. John, on the end. Tell me, what is a federated identity, and is it even realistic?
Yeah, so I think we touched upon that slightly earlier. So the idea is to try and remove the identity, username, password conundrum that we all have. So I think I read the other day that it's quite easy to remember your username, but you probably have 20 different passwords, or you may have one, which is obviously going to be very dangerous if it does get breached. So some of the initiatives within, like I mentioned before, the UK government are heading down a very successful pilot at the moment. It's probably past a pilot with a verify.uk.gov, where they're actually connecting a lot of the UK agencies together through a single credential. So you go through a very stringent authentication process initially, and then you can use that same credential across various other government sites. The US have been trying to do it for several years through the NSTIC initiative. That's the National Strategy for Trust, Identity, and Cyberspace. That had a lot of momentum. There were several pilots that were actually pushed out for that. And up until now, each agency has been doing verification very siloed. So the SSA, you would go through an individual verification. If you wanted to sign up for healthcare through healthcare.gov, it would be a separate authentication. If you're a veteran, you go through a separate verification, even though the levels of assurance, the actual access systems were very similar. So I think they are going to come together more on the public sector side. I think the challenge in the private sector is what I mentioned before about liability. So would a private sector institution accept a publicly generated credential, given they had no real say in how that authentication was done? And I think that's going to be the issue. It comes down to registration, really, and I think until that liability piece is resolved, I think the federated identity is a fantastic idea, but I think it does have that initial challenge.
Right. Let's talk a little bit, since we're having this conversation about identity and verification. What about compliance? When we met, we talked a bit about Know Your Customer and ALM, anti-money laundering compliance. How can some of your tools help mobile payments providers and app providers comply with those laws, and what are some of the challenges with fraud?
You go first, I'll go
Okay,
second.
all right. So I think from our perspective, we're obviously looking to make sure that the data sources that we offer are very stringent, the due diligence is very strong. The traditional type data sources like credit bureau information, electoral roll, government documents, government IDs are all very established. Each country obviously has different like AML type requirements for onboarding, somewhat subjected by client. But the standards are somewhat similar. There are also differences by region. I think that the long-term view is what's actually classed as traditional. So from a thin file perspective, you've got a lot of people that are 18 years old, 19 years old, that have got very thin footprints from a traditional perspective. But they may have a huge amount of information from social network information or from transaction information. So I think that's where we're at least hoping that the path will go. That's obviously been looked at for several years. The value is definitely there. There is a huge amount of value in the non-traditional type social information to verify and help verify people who are like especially thin file. That's both from a traditional market and a new market perspective. So that's hopefully something that we'll see going forward.
So our systems, do KYC and help you meet compliance with that. Some of the challenges that we see relate to just the level of regulation that's come forward from the government on this. The issuing banks that basically are the pipe for this in many ways are under extreme pressure from regulators. That pressure gets pushed to you relative to the compliance. So it's really important that you have a vendor that helps you basically meet those best practices from a standpoint of the regulatory guidance. That, by the way, is not, everybody interprets it differently, right? You can go read the regs for this and it says match 3 out of 4, and everybody that looks at it has different viewpoints on what that means, and the banks can take differing guidelines relative to this. So, and they frequently change the rules too. I mean, the banks get burned on something and then they come in and they change what the rules are. So again, being able to quickly change this stuff is important. I also think as regulators look more and more at the breach data, that the issues of fraud will also get involved in the CIP process, which is not, or the KYC process, which is not really part of that today. Companies say, I've got the regulatory compliance relative to my bank, and then I got to stop all the fraud, right? So they really have two things that they have to look at relative to those. So this is ever evolving relative to that, and you just want to make sure you work with folks that can have tremendous domain expertise relative to it and can also be adaptable.
Yeah, those of you who are merchants and are active in merchant advocacy in Washington know that the folks on my end, the financial institutions, are really gunning for part of that compliance burden to be shifted off of the financial institutions and at least shared, right, with the merchants, or just pushed off on you. So I think that's something we'll be hearing a lot more about.
Yeah, the challenge with that too, right, is the issuing bank takes the risk, right? So they look at it as, in many cases, that even though it's your customer, it's also their customer, and they have to be careful relative to the risk. So there's a lot of pressure going back and forth between those two that just increase cost.
Yeah, it's not just cost, it's also reputational risk, because a lot of consumers don't put it all together. They just know that the holder of the account is either having to replace their card or there's money missing, and so they really feel that. Though, let's move back to the technology folks here in the middle. Naomi, the mobile wallet seems to be split between chip-based security and full software security. Tell us, is there a third option?
Yeah, I'm sure that there are going to be many options down the line. We don't always, we can't foresee what's going to come, but surely it won't end just there. I did touch upon an option that exists, which is a little bit of the middle ground, which is basically using the on-device security features. Basically, the capabilities of the operating system to allow you to do certain operations in a secure container that isn't vulnerable to malware. So there are certain things like when you're entering a PIN and you're using the keyboard function of the mobile phone, or even when you're using the fingerprint sensor, there's some information that's getting transferred from component to component inside the mobile device. And you don't want any point of your application to be vulnerable to malware. So the idea is to be able to use those security features in order to secure also those operations. So this is something that's known as a trusted execution environment or a trust zone. It's an area in the phone that you can use. So I think it's important to bear it in mind and to know that there is that extra option that comes over software security to give you that capability, and you can actually convey to your consumer, the user, that they are in a trusted area of the application. Okay, so no one can get in there while I'm typing my PIN code. No malware that can track where my fingers are pressing. Okay, and afterwards try to understand what my PIN was and use that elsewhere. So I think there are something like 350 million devices already out there that have trusted execution environments on them, and you can make use of them. The issue is that it's not all devices. So there is some fragmentation that exists in the Android environment, but still there are certain operations that require a higher level of security. When you have the option to use those more secure features, you should take advantage of them. The more risky the operation, the more layers of security you should put in there. And like we said, because those fraudsters are looking for the weakest link, so don't give them any openings. If you need to, seal it off by using those extra security features that are available.
Did you have anything to add?
No, I basically concur with that. The one area as a security person that I see that trusted execution environments have, and this is their conundrum, is that so TEEs started out where what you would do is you would build the software into the firmware of the device, and then trusted firmware, and then the trusted firmware would be loaded into the trusted execution environment, and that was fine. Obviously, the problem with that is, and the reason TEEs are not widely used, is nobody can get their firmware built into, nobody can get their software built into the firmware of somebody's phone, right? Or it's a very difficult process and very expensive. It has to be made into the phone at manufacturing time. So what they've done, what the push now is to figure out how can you dynamically deliver software into the trusted execution environment in a way that is dynamic, so that you can just add your code to the trusted execution environment and have it delivered. And of course, when you do that, well, now you've opened up a hole because it's now has to go through the operating system to deliver code into the TEE. So that's one of the concerns, and it's not that it's not being addressed, but that is one of the things that's slowing down the adoption of that. There's no doubt that the one thing you can never get rid of without a TEE is basically PIN snooping, as Naomi said, right? So basically you can always keylog, right? That's always an option that a hacker can do. And the only thing that could really prevent that is if you had a TEE that you know is secure, because what happens is when you press the screen, a hardware interrupt actually takes you into the TEE mode of the machine, and it reads the screen and nothing else can read it. So ideally, that's where we want to be heading, but the uptake is very difficult because of that delivery problem. How do you deliver code into the TEE that you know has not been tampered with?
But I would, there's nothing like a panel without a little controversy. So I would say that that part is actually that there are trusted, we call them trusted service managers, right? That are allowed and have the keys given to them by the issuer of those credentials and have permission to put things in the trusted execution environment and make those trusted applications. So it's not that it's impossible, you just have to work with one of those companies that is allowed. And those 350 trusted execution environments that I mentioned are indeed already accessible. I think that what TE suffers from is the issue of fragmentation, meaning I can't cover 100% of my consumers using that, so should I do it? But the more and more devices that are out there with TEs, I think that it will become more commonplace. And at least in the meantime, it should be considered as something to use when available for especially risky operations before it becomes commonplace and can be done
Yep.
for everyone.
And I would just add that as a security person, I just see that as a whole, right? Because it has to go through the operating system to be delivered. And so it's just another one of those things where I'm just looking down the road and saying, okay, when we seal up this and this and this, then they're going to go after that, right, as the next. So, security is never perfect.
Can I add something to that?
Sure.
So
please.
this is
Yeah.
pretty complicated, huh? That's even above my head. The thing that I would encourage people to think about relative, again, is layers, right? So when it comes to these, the fraudsters are getting really sophisticated relative to breaking phones and basically taking over those phones. And the ability to see change events, right, as another layer of what's happening to that phone, I think is relatively important and a new thing, right? We just launched this in the last month. The ability to basically see that a phone has been lost or stolen or reported that way, that a phone has been ported recently, right? It's moved from AT&T to Verizon, and surprise, surprise, now the person is trying to buy a $5,000 TV. Right, that's a flag, right? Large transaction coming from a mobile device, and then you're able to check a change event to basically say something happened to this device that is of a concern to me, and then you escalate the transaction. So the more data you can get, whether it's securing the device, also looking at what's happening in the network at that point in time, what's happened to that device, right? Has it something recently changed with it? And then, relative to account information from the carriers, as you pull more and more of this stuff together and have more layers, then you're going to have more security. And the cool thing about it is that there's no friction, right? It all happens under the covers, and it can all happen pretty quickly, because at the end of the day, what you want to make sure of is that the legitimate people get through, and they get through quickly, right? We love talking about fraud. It's cool. It's a challenge. But most customers are legit. So what you need to do is you need to build systems that basically recognize that and give you the ability to move the legitimate people through quickly, and then flag the things that look a little suspicious.
Excellent, thank you. Do we have any questions from the audience? All right, well, we are out of time. So thank you so much for sticking around, and enjoy your evening. We'll see you tomorrow.